Before the phoenix ever rises, the adepts did something most modern shadow work never teaches. They entered the furnace deliberately, not to chase literal gold and not to glorify suffering, but to trigger a controlled collapse of the false self. A Renaissance physician, Magus, call him Master Severin, said the work begins when the outer mask can no longer breathe. If you've ever felt trapped inside repeating patterns, you're not weak. You're simply trying to change without consenting to dissolution. The caricature of alchemy is a primitive lab. The real laboratory was the psyche. The furnace was consciousness under pressure, the moment your identity can't hold the life you're living. And here's what everyone skips. The burning isn't an accident. It's a method. In the oldest manuals, the operator doesn't wait for life to shatter him. He steps toward the heat, because only the self that agrees to die can be rebuilt. The old manuals describe this as an inner chamber, but not in the modern self-care sense. More like a sealed vessel. A closed container where your usual identity can't leak out and distract itself. The adepts had names for it: the retort, the athanor, the secret room. And the first rule was always the same: close the door. Not a metaphor for privacy, a psychological instruction. Shut out the sensory world long enough that the mind stops performing, because the persona survives by being observed, by being busy, by keeping the surface moving so the depths never speak. Here's the pattern that repeats across the tradition. First, withdrawal. Second, ignition. Third, the collapse of what you thought was you. And when the ignition begins, it rarely feels spiritual. It feels like your strategies stop working. The career that once impressed you starts to taste like dust. The relationship that defined you becomes strangely hollow. Your old ambitions can't hold your attention. You try to force the old self to continue, and it won't. Most people call that depression, failure, bad luck. The adepts called it the first heat, calcination, not punishment. Pressure. The moment the false structure starts cracking so the real material can appear. Now, the mistake is to treat calcination like an emergency. To rush into distraction, numbing, reinvention, anything to restore the old comfort. But the work says, don't patch the mask. Don't repaint the prison. Stay with the heat long enough for the illusion to turn to powder. A later occult philosopher, let's call her Aurelia of Lyon, warned that most seekers perform a false opus. They mimic change with new aesthetics, new beliefs, new labels. But underneath, the same ego keeps the throne. Different costume, same ruler. Calcination is the moment you finally admit, quietly and without drama, this life as configured cannot continue. Not because the world is wrong, but because the self you built to survive has outlived its purpose. And here's what makes this dangerous and sacred at the same time. When the shell cracks, you feel exposed, your old certainty dissolves. You can't rely on the story that used to explain everything. You're tempted to run back to familiar suffering, because at least it has a map. But the furnace doesn't respond to bargaining. It responds to consent. The first act of real occultism is not a ritual. It's agreement. Agreement to let the old identity burn without immediately replacing it. After the powder comes the flood. The texts call it dissolution, solutio. And if calcination feels like cracking, solutio feels like losing shape. This is where people panic, because the ego interprets fluidity as death. Your boundaries blur, your preferences shift. You can't tell what you truly want versus what you were trained to want. And strange phenomena often appear here. Not magic tricks, but signals from depth. Dreams become vivid and heavy with symbols. You notice patterns you used to ignore. Coincidences start clustering. The rational mind tries to clamp down, but it can't, because control was part of the old shell. Aurelia described solutio as the invasion of forgotten material. What you buried comes up. The grief you avoided. The anger you spiritualized away. The desires you disowned to be acceptable. And because the old container is weakened, these contents arrive with force. This is where modern culture mislabels the process. It calls it a breakdown and tries to restore the previous equilibrium as quickly as possible. Sometimes stabilization is necessary, yes, but the alchemical warning is precise. Premature repair can freeze you between identities half dissolved, half pretending. Solutio has one demand: let the old form fully melt, so something new can actually reorganize. The phoenix cannot rise while it's still clinging to its previous feathers. Then comes the stage every tradition circles, but few describe plainly: the blackening, the negredo, the descent where the psyche feels like winter with no promise of spring. If solutio is melting, negredo is rot-old meanings decomposing so they can become soil. This is not a dramatic Gothic mood. It's the terrifying simplicity of waking up and realizing your previous story cannot be believed anymore. The ideals that carried you success, romance, status, even certain spiritual beliefs start to feel like thin props, and when the props collapse, you discover what was underneath: emptiness, uncertainty, and a silence that doesn't comfort you. The manuals insist this stage is unavoidable. They depict it as burial, as night, as a king laid in a tomb, not because you are cursed, but because the old ruler must die for the true authority to emerge. And the most disorienting part is isolation. Even surrounded by people, you feel alone because you can't explain what's happening. Language fails. You're between worlds. The old self is dead. The new self hasn't stabilized. This is where most people abandon the work. They rebuild a copy of their former identity to stop the discomfort. The tradition calls that the return to the lead, going back to unconsciousness, because awareness became too expensive. But negredo is not proof you failed. It's proof the furnace is working. So what do you do in the negredo? Here is where the old teachers become very specific. They don't say, think positive. They don't say, manifest light. They say, remain in the vessel, stay sealed. Do not flee the darkness with compulsive remedies, because the blackening has an intelligence. It is not random suffering. It is the psyche removing what is false by letting it collapse under its own weight. The grief is a solvent. The boredom is a signal. The emptiness is a clearing. Aurelia wrote that the operator must practice still containment. Not numbing, not analysis loops, but the discipline of not immediately translating pain into distraction. The ego wants instant narrative. This happened because I need to fix. I must become. But the work demands a pause long enough for the deeper order to rearrange itself. And yes, this can look like depression from the outside, which is why the line matters. If your safety is at risk, get help. The tradition never required self-destruction. But it does require honesty. Some discomfort is not pathology, it's metamorphosis. The phoenix stage here is ash, not wings, not flame, ash, and ash is not nothing. Ash is material ready to receive a new pattern. And then quietly, almost offensively subtle light returns. The texts call it the whitening, albedo, not the final gold, not triumphant rebirth, just the first clean signal that the decomposition produced something usable. This is where many people make a second mistake. After weeks or months of darkness, the first relief feels like salvation, so they grab it and declare the work finished. New job, new philosophy, new identity badge. But albedo is fragile. It's a sprout, not a tree. In albedo, insight arrives with sharp clarity. You suddenly see why certain relationships repeated, why your type was actually a wound, why your ambition was a substitute for belonging, why you kept reenacting the same conflict with different faces. And for the first time, the insight doesn't feel like information, it feels embodied. You don't just understand, you recognize. This is also the phase where the shadow re-enters differently. The parts of you rejected need Sensitivity, rage, desire stop looking like enemies. They start looking like exiled citizens, and integration begins not forgiving yourself in theory, but actually making room inside your life for what you used to deny. Albedo requires patience. The new form needs time to harden. Otherwise, the old gravity pulls you back into the previous orbit. Now the work shifts from surviving to building. Because albedo isn't just feeling better, it's learning a new way to live without rebuilding the old cage. The manuals describe repeated cycles of heating and cooling, tempering. Too much fire and you shatter, too much comfort and you go soft. The operator learns rhythm. This is where the tradition becomes practical. How do you stabilize a new self? Not by forcing perfection, but by changing what you feed. The old identity was sustained by noise, constant input, constant comparison, constant performance. The new identity needs silence like a plant needs soil. So the adepts built disciplines not as moral rules, but as architecture. They limited stimuli. They watched attention like a hawk. They treated daily choices as ingredients going into the vessel, because every habit is a spell, whether you call it that or not. Aurelia called this the second ceiling. You've already closed the door on the false persona collapsing. Now you close the door on the world that keeps trying to reinstall it. Friends might not recognize you. Your old social role may dissolve. Some will call you lost. Others will call you arrogant. But what's really happening is simpler. You're no longer available for the previous script. And that's when the final phase becomes possible. Because the end of the Phoenix work is not becoming pure. It's the union, the conjunctio, the marriage of opposites that used to tear you apart. The tradition never aimed to eliminate contradiction. It aimed to make contradiction productive. Most people live split. One face for the world, one face in private. One set of values they preach, another set they obey. One part of them wants freedom, another part clings to safety. And they call that personality. The adepts called it fragmentation. Conjunctio is when the divided parts stop warring and start cooperating. Not because you forced harmony, but because the fire burned away the false ruler that kept everything separated. In Jung's language, this is individuation. The ego learns it is not the whole kingdom. It becomes a steward, not a tyrant. You can see the signs. You become harder to manipulate because you know your own shadow. Praise doesn't intoxicate you the way it used to. Criticism doesn't destroy you. You can hold tenderness and boundary at the same time. Rationality and intuition stop being enemies. Solitude stops being loneliness. And this is the detail people miss. The phoenix that returns is not the phoenix you imagine. It carries ash in its memory. It knows it will burn again. But now the burning is no longer a catastrophe. It's a process you recognize. But there is a point in the work where everything feels like a mistake. The manuals describe it as the threshold crisis. The moment after the old self has died, but before the new self has enough structure to stand. You're not who you were. You're not yet who you're becoming. And that in between feels like free fall. This is where the mind produces its most brutal question. What if there's nothing on the other side? What if the phoenix is just myth and you're simply burned? No teacher can answer that for you because reassurance doesn't touch it. This is existential. You sacrificed certainties without a contract promising replacement. You let identities dissolve without a guarantee of meaning, and the psyche hates that. It wants a label, a role, a doctrine, anything to stop the uncertainty. So the temptation returns, rebuild the old life, reinstall the old persona, become the previous version of you with a spiritual costume. But the tragedy is you can't fully go back. The furnace already revealed what the mask was hiding. Even if you rebuild it, it won't fit the same. In the tradition, this is the real decision point. Not whether you can endure pain, but whether you can endure not knowing without fleeing into a convenient lie. And if you remain, if you let the uncertainty do its work, something strange happens. The despair becomes useful, not romantic, not beautiful suffering. Useful, like a knife removing what can't live. Because when you stop demanding certainty, you stop negotiating with reality. You begin to see what is. The meaning you were trying to borrow, from status, from belonging, from other people's approval, falls away. And what remains is smaller, quieter, but real, your direct experience. This is where the occult becomes less theatrical and more honest. The hidden is not a secret society. It's the layer of your own psyche you couldn't access while you were constantly performing. The inner world starts speaking in a new vocabulary. Symbols, bodily signals, sudden clarity, dreams that feel like instructions. Aurelia called it the return of the inner guide. Jung would call it the self and organizing intelligence deeper than the ego. You don't control it, but you can cooperate with it. And cooperation looks like this. You stop treating every discomfort as a problem to be eliminated, and you start asking, what is being dismantled? What is trying to be born? That shift changes everything. The fire is no longer an enemy. It becomes an instrument. The furnace stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like a workshop. Now, let's make the method explicit. Not the whole work, because no script can substitute for lived experience. But the entry sequence the adepts use to initiate the phoenix process without collapsing into chaos. First, create the vessel. Pick a time when you won't be interrupted. Not because silence is nice, but because interruption reactivates the persona. The mask loves company. Second, reduce input. No music, no scrolling, no background noise. Sit still long enough that your nervous system stops searching for stimulation. This is the closing of the door. It is a deliberate refusal to feed the old identity. Third, observe the mind without negotiating with it. Thoughts will offer bargains. Do this later. Fix your life tomorrow. Just distract yourself for a minute. Don't fight them. Don't follow them. Let them pass like smoke in a sealed room. Fourth, locate the pressure point. The place in you that feels tight, ashamed, angry. Empty whatever is most alive. The tradition doesn't start with ideals. It starts with the actual material. This is the moment most people flinch. They try to rise into light. The adepts did the opposite. They stayed with the raw sensation until it stopped being a story and became an energy. And when that energy is finally felt, not explained, not justified, something opens. A small gap between you and your reactions. That gap is the beginning of freedom, because the old self is mostly reflex, stimulus, narrative, defense. The furnace interrupts the chain. This is why the symbolism matters. In the engravings, the king drowns in mercury. That is not a historic recipe. It's an image of the ego losing its rigid throne inside the solvent of the unconscious. When you sit in the vessel and let the pressure speak, you are doing the same thing. You are allowing the ruling identity to be relativized. At this stage, do not demand visions. Do not demand signs. The work is quieter than your expectations. What you're training is containment, the ability to remain present with intensity without discharging it into habit. If you do this consistently, you'll notice life begins rearranging around you. Not because you manifested, but because you stop volunteering for the old pattern. The same situations appear and you respond differently. The same temptation arrives and it no longer fits. The same trigger hits and it doesn't own you. This is the first proof that the phoenix is real, not fireworks, but altered reflex. The old self starts dying in dozens of small moments, and the new self begins assembling itself from the parts you once rejected. Now we need to address the most common sabotage: spiritual bypassing. The moment the work gets heavy, people reach for high vibration language to escape the underworld. But the underworld is where the ore is. If you refuse the dark material, you refuse the gold. The adepts had a brutal phrase: no tincture without putrefaction. Translation: no true medicine without decay. The parts of you that disgust you, the memories you avoid, the traits you condemn in others, that is the compost. That is what feeds the new configuration. This doesn't mean indulging darkness. It means meeting it without pretending you're above it. When anger arises, don't moralize it. Ask what boundary it protects. When grief arises, don't suppress it. Ask what it honors. When envy arises, don't shame it. Ask what desire it reveals. This is how occultism becomes usable in daily life. The symbol is not decoration. It is a tool for reading your own psyche. Fire means pressure. Water means dissolution. Black means decomposition. White means first integration. Union means wholeness through tension. And here's the paradox. The more honestly you face the impure material, the less it controls you. What remains unconscious behaves like a demon. What becomes conscious becomes a resource. If you're wondering where the famous figures fit into this is exactly why later thinkers treated alchemy as a psychological archive. A Swiss depth psychologist, let's call him Dr. Alaric, spent years with these images because he recognized something modern people were missing. The psyche speaks in symbols long before it speaks in explanations. He argued the old operators weren't foolish chemists. They were early cartographers of transformation, recording inner events as if they were outer experiments. And when you read the texts that way, the sequence becomes unmistakable. Crisis, dissolution, darkness, integration, union. This matters because it reframes your life. The breakdown you feared becomes a stage. The confusion you hated becomes a sign. The identity collapse becomes a doorway. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you start asking, "Which phase am I in? And what does this phase require?" And each phase requires a different discipline. Calcination requires honesty. Solutio requires surrender. Negrito requires endurance. Albedo requires patience. Conjunctio requires integration of opposites, not the extermination of one side. You don't need to join a lodge to apply this. You need to stop treating your psyche like an enemy and start treating it like a laboratory with laws. When you cooperate with the laws, suffering becomes less random. It becomes directional. And the most practical law is this: whatever you refuse to feel will keep deciding your life. That's not mysticism. It's mechanics. The unconscious doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It repeats, it projects, it recruits your choices. So the Phoenix work isn't about becoming better. It's about becoming less governed by hidden forces. The mask collapses not to humiliate you, but to liberate you from automatic living. Here's a simple daily application. When you get triggered, jealous, defensive, compulsive, pause and ask 3 questions, like an operator checking a flame. What identity is being threatened right now? 2. What sensation is underneath the story? 3. If I don't discharge this into habit, what truth remains? That third question is the furnace, because it forces you to remain in the vessel long enough for the reflex to dissolve, and at first, it will feel unbearable. Not because it is unbearable, but because you are not trained to contain intensity without acting it out. Over time, the containment becomes strength. Metallurgists call it temper hardness, earned through controlled heating and cooling. That's what the Phoenix gains, not constant happiness, but resilience, clarity, and the ability to hold contradiction without splitting. Now we arrive at the real payoff. The moment you realize the Phoenix is not a one-time event, it's a cycle. The person who completes one round doesn't graduate into permanent peace. They gain something more valuable, trust in the process, because life will bring new fires, loss, betrayal, failure, sudden change. And for most people, those fires feel like collapse. For the operator, they feel like material. Another layer ready to be refined. This is why the reborn self looks different. Not perfect, integrated. You still feel fear, but it doesn't steer the wheel. You still feel sadness, But it doesn't convince you the world is meaningless. You still feel desire, but you can choose and you become harder to hypnotize by culture, by trends, by group emotions, because you've differentiated from the collective trance. You can admire beauty without worshiping it. You can pursue success without using it as identity. You can love without turning love into a religion. And the deepest shift is humility. The ego stops pretending it is the author of everything. You recognize your consciousness rises from depths that remain partly mysterious. The self, the organizing intelligence, continues unfolding. More integrations await, more burnings will come. But now you know fire does not erase you, it refines you. So here's the final teaching the old furnace leaves in your hands. Transformation isn't granted by luck, and it isn't achieved by decorating the ego with new beliefs. It's realized through willingness, the willingness to let what is false collapse and to stay present while it collapses. The gold was never a substance. It was coherence, a self no longer divided against itself, a consciousness that can face darkness without fleeing, face success without worshiping, face uncertainty without bargaining away its truth. If you take only one thing from this, take the sequence. When life brings heat, don't rush to restore the mask, build the vessel, close the door, let the pressure speak. Allow dissolution to complete. Endure the blackening without calling it failure. Protect the first light without grasping it. Unite the opposites instead of choosing one side as spiritual and the other as bad. That is the Phoenix Rite. Practical occultism is inner engineering. And if you want to test this, don't wait for a dramatic crisis. Tonight, take 10 minutes. No noise, no input. Sit, breathe. Find the tightest place in you. Stay with it until it becomes energy, not story. That is the threshold. Cross it often enough, and one day you'll realize you're no longer visiting the furnace.